Hello everyone, I'm your host Fola. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Diversifying Research podcast. This is a podcast where we amplify the voices of underrepresented individuals who are either involved in research themselves or engage other underrepresented groups in research. Over the course of this limited podcast series, we will critically consider how to improve the inclusion of underrepresented voices in research. During this episode, we're joined by De-Shaine Murray, who is a Black Caribbean PhD student. I invited him on because an important aspect of improving representation is about understanding the experiences of underrepresented groups within academia. De-Shaine is going to talk about his experiences moving to the West Midlands and transitioning to university, as well as navigating academia, and finally, the provision of support for students at university. Hello, De-Shaine. How are you?
Hi, Fola. I'm very good, thank you.
Great. So to start off with, can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is De-Shaine Murray, as was mentioned before. And I'm a second-year PhD student in the field of neurotechnology at Imperial College London. And essentially, I look at neurotechnology as anything to do with the brain and technology and linking them together. But for my specific research, I actually look into brain injury and how to monitor that by fabricating devices that can be placed on the cortex of the brain and monitor electrical and chemical signals.
That sounds like really impactful research. So can you tell us a bit about your academic background as well?
Yeah, sure. So I essentially went to university, the University of Birmingham, studied chemistry initially, did a master's, so an MSci in that. So that was an integrated master's for 4 years. And straight after that, I came straight to Imperial College London, where I was put onto the CDT program, so Centre for Doctoral Training for Neurotechnology for Life and Health. And that was in 2017, if I remember rightly. And essentially went from there. But in the research group I am now in, my primary research group is based at Imperial, but I have a secondary research group, which is based at the University of Cambridge.
It's great to see that you've really excelled academically. But it makes me think about statistics from the Department for Education. They've published data that shows the high exclusion rates of Afro-Caribbean boys in particular, and the fact that they tend to have lower educational attainment. Is that something that you resonate with at all or not?
Myself personally, no, but I see where this could be the case quite easily. Firstly, there's a lot of stereotypes about young Black male Caribbeans. A lot of misconceptions about us, and this can easily play into the teaching and learning environment. I would say what helped me is partly my upbringing, the home I was in, the way I was guided literally from start to finish, and helped with my education from my parents. So shout out to definitely to the both of them. But essentially, this is a problem that does exist within our schools, and it can be partly to do with the fact that we have a lot of teachers that may not understand these kids and where they're coming from and their backgrounds and experiences. I myself have never had a Black teacher. I've never had a Black lecturer. And I've been in education, as in full-time education, for 20 years straight. So I think that in itself can say a lot about just the potential barriers that there are. And I guess lack of being able to understand young Black Caribbean males in the system that they are in.
Yeah, it definitely can. And so I understand that you sort of grew up in Thornton Heath and then you moved to West Midlands and you went to a grammar school there. And then you studied chemistry at the University of Birmingham. Do you think that there are any parallels between your experiences at grammar school and at university?
Yeah, most definitely. So I guess to clarify, yeah, I was born in Croydon and raised in Thornton Heath, but that was only for like the first 5 years of my life, even though a lot of my family were and still are based in South London. But yeah, I went to the West Midlands. That was a very different experience for me. But in terms of specifically your question with university life and the grammar school life, essentially, yeah, I got that preparation from very early on because the grammar school experience was a very isolating one as a Black student. So going into that, there were only 4 of us in the year who were Black out of a possible, 150, 160. So you actually went in with essentially being an ambassador for your race, because a lot of people would go in there and the only time they'd ever experienced or seen Black people as young kids was through what they had been told by their parents and through what they had seen through the media. So there was a lot of ignorance. There was a lot of overt racism. There were a lot of misconceptions. That essentially did prepare me for what came later, because at the University of Birmingham, again, in chemistry, in my year, there are 4 or 5 of us, if I remember rightly. And essentially, I was prepared because I'd been in that environment from 11 to 18 previously.
Really interesting comments. And you mentioning that you felt like you were sort of an ambassador for your race, that makes me think about the fact that there are people from different backgrounds to you who might have other privileges that don't necessarily have those experiences. Could you inform us more about what that sort of meant for you and the psychological impact of feeling like you were an ambassador for your race?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because essentially growing up in a multicultural environment, which I did, and then going to another environment which very much at times seemed quite homogeneous and didn't quite fully understand me and myself. It was very much a culture shock. Is very different. And in terms of being an ambassador for your race, I say that because a lot of the time I was the only experience that my friends at the time or my colleagues or peers had of Black people. So they would come with their preconceived notions of me, stereotypes about what my family were like, about what I was like, about parts of my body and what they were like, about my behavior. And essentially it was like you constantly had to dispel those myths. And that was very difficult growing up. I had a very fast tongue in that respect in terms of responses. But yeah, that weighs on you because essentially that was me at a very young age learning how to code switch. And I would say I'm very, very good at it and very good at showing a certain aspect of myself or a certain side of myself rather than the full picture, but it shouldn't be that way. And that will weigh on you heavily. And in terms of psychological impact, I would say I've definitely come to terms with it now, but there are times I look back on certain things that have happened or did happen at school, even just sometimes the way I used to actually just go to the bathroom and just have to collect myself after someone had said something just to make sure that people didn't see just how much some of the comments were affecting me and then go back into the classroom like nothing was happening. That is not a good environment to be in. And I would hate for anybody else to be in that environment. And that continued throughout school. And at times I did have that through university too.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot to really deal with. And in terms of code switching, do you feel like it's been important to do so in order to succeed in academia?
I would say in the current state that academia is in, yes. Academia is very much, again, it's homogeneous. It's one set of people from a specific class who are from a specific side of society and they have specific ways of doing things. So if you don't fit into that mold, you will never be able to navigate through. And I think it's therefore important. It's important, of course, to be yourself, but there are some institutions, some places, and some environments that it can be very difficult to be yourself because you will be misunderstood. So I think it's very important to prepare anyone that's coming up through this route to know that, yeah, you may have to code switch a little bit. You may not be able to be fully yourself. I hope that will change. But at this current point and period in time, I would say no. In order to get through it, you kind of have to code switch a little bit.
Yeah, and that's a massive shame. And I guess you were accustomed to code switching because you had that background growing up in the West Midlands, but also going to a grammar school. And I guess I'm mindful of the fact that some people might be listening to this podcast. They have an offer to go to a prestigious institution and they might have never had to code switch in their life. So if you could give them some advice, what would you say to them?
So that's a difficult one. The first thing I'm going to say is, regardless, go. You being in this institution is important. So it's just about having that resilience, first of all. But secondly, is be prepared to be judged on certain things. I don't know really how to say or put it in words, but be prepared that there are certain misconceptions, certain stereotypes that you're going to hear. And instead of reacting to it there and then, sometimes you have to not necessarily accept it, but be prepared to kind of take it on the chin. I would say that's essentially what a lot of code switching is. I wouldn't want to say you dilute yourself, but you show a side of yourself, but not your full self. And sometimes it almost feels like you're acting. I wouldn't say that it is, but it's a very, very difficult one. But my advice to anyone is be your calm self, your calmest self in these environments, because essentially when you are someone's only experience of blackness or one of the few experiences of blackness, you get a lot of things projected onto you. And that's hard to deal with regardless.
Definitely. And do you think you've been able to find spaces that you haven't had to code switch within academic institutions, but also just in wider society whilst you've been studying?
I'm sure. So I haven't mentioned it yet, but I would say my family were definitely the place where I didn't have to code switch. I could be myself. I had that support system. So my parents sacrificed a lot for me. I'm very grateful to my dad for the things that he's done for me, and my mother too, being able to take the time off from her career in order to make sure that I had that love for education. And I already did have it, but she really fostered that in me too. So definitely both of them. I would say my church environment was another great factor, and still is a great factor of strength and support, where I can definitely be myself. And I had all of this growing up and going through education. I needed it. But what I then seen in academic institutions is there's that lack. And now, even with moving away from home and being away from my parents and being out of that church community, even though I'm still a part of it, that's where I've seen it be more difficult to navigate and be a struggle. So essentially from that, I've decided to create my own spaces, because academia has not afforded those spaces and has currently not tried to integrate a lot of people who look like me in that respect. So if it's not there and you can't see the change, you have to be it. So that's what I've done.
That's really inspiring. Could you tell us a bit more about these spaces that you've created and how you went about creating the spaces?
Yeah, sure. So the first space I'd like to talk about is the African Caribbean Research Collective. I should also note that we now have a West African Research Collective, and that these are closely intertwined and essentially are sister groups. So they'll be growing together. But I'd just like to put that out there, because that is essentially what this is about. And it's about growing within communities, but having that collective goal to move towards something bigger. And the way in which both groups are growing is really quite exciting. But I'll talk about that more later. But essentially, the African Caribbean Research Collective came about from a Leading Roots report in September of last year, which really, from a Freedom of Information request, highlighted the appalling statistics to do with Black students in general in terms of academia and receiving funded PhD studentships from the UKRI. But then that was coupled and really had an effect on me, because within that report, it talked about Black Caribbean students specifically, and just how few of those had received PhD studentships. So there's actually a statistic in there that talks about, in the 3 academic years, I think it was between 2016 and 2019, 30 students of Black Caribbean descent in the UK were awarded PhD studentships. And that's out of a possible, I think it was 19,800 or so. So I will let the viewers and the listeners do the statistics or do the calculations on that. But that's really appalling. And from there, I was actually tagged in the report on Twitter from my cousin, who happens to also be part of that statistic. And essentially from there, we galvanized and we found each other. We started with the I'm one of 30 sort of tagline and really just looked to find each other and find that community. And from there, it's really just grown. We've become very good friends, almost like family. We're very much a community. We support each other's wins. We've helped each other through very hard times, especially through this period of lockdown with COVID and the ongoing social movements that we are trying to deal with. And yeah, essentially that's where we've gone. And really what helped us actually was within lockdown, the increased use of things like Zoom. We really one person in the group, Samantha, said, let's just meet via video. And that really that visual representation, seeing each other on a screen and being able to talk about our experiences in a space where we're not interrupted, where we feel we can be ourselves is something very powerful. But there's a lot to come with regards to the African Caribbean Research Collective. And there's even more to come with the West African Research Collective and building these groups together and having one potentially Black research collective, which is coming, basically.
Wow, that's really, really inspiring. And I'm glad that you found a support system that works for you and you have people who understand your struggle and your experiences as well. You haven't touched on the Black in Neuro sort of network, which I think is amazing. And I'm sure our listeners will want to know more about it. So could you talk a bit about that and what your involvement has been?
Yeah, sure. So where to start? This is essentially... So Black in Neuro is definitely something that was more quick. It was more of a whirlwind. It was something that had a very short time in terms of the way we put it together, but it was executed perfectly. That really goes down to the team and just how amazing they were. I would like to say and preface that with, we were not all Black. We had our allies with us. And if you want to see a perfect example of allyship and doing things as part of a team where the burden was taken off of the Black members of the group, essentially that group there, and they're all tagged on Twitter, but I guess I can find their names. They execute things perfectly. But I guess if I go a little bit further back and talk about my own experiences from seeing, even in Black academia, and seeing no visibility, from being an undergraduate and seeing cleaners and admin staff who were Black. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But then seeing the lecturers being white and seeing that contrast. And me as an aspiring academic, at the time I didn't know I was going to do a PhD, but going up through the ranks of academia and seeing that in any institution I was going to, that has an effect on you. There's that real lack of visibility, that lack of physical role models. So really with Black in Neuro, that's what we did. We made ourselves visible. It was this online campaign. We showed that there are these Black neuroscientists across the globe. And just from that, the impressions and the analytics we've done, we reached across the globe. And yeah, essentially to show our communities that we are here and you can be here too. But for more of a background, essentially, these sorts of campaigns are not new. This sort of thing started with Black in STEM on Twitter. We've also had Black in the Ivory over the course of this lockdown period. But essentially what really galvanized a lot of these movements was Black Birders Week. And Black Birders Week came about from the incident in New York Central Park with Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper. Funny enough, had the same surname, but no relation. But yeah, during that time, he was Christian Cooper, who was a Black man, was in the park and he was birding. And there was a woman who had her dog and he respectfully asked her to put the dog on a leash. And from there, she began to cry wolf and to call the police. And essentially was calling the police to say that she was being harmed. And that behavior has been documented before. We've seen those sorts of things before where lies have been told about Black people and there have been serious consequences from that. Even a little unrelated, but going back, if you look at US history, essentially lies are what led to the death of Emmett Till and extreme racism. But essentially that's what galvanized Black Birders Week. After Black Birders Week, there was Black Botanist Week. After Black Botanist Week, there was Black in Astro Week. And literally from there, we've just built on that. And yeah, essentially that's where the week came from. But Black in Neuro, as a team, as a committee, it's gone so well. And the support was so strong with the community that this is something that will exist past the week. I can't say the full details of which yet, but this is going to be big and it's going to potentially change a lot for Black neuroscientists and that community in general.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what you guys achieve with that network. But it's been so good to see everything you've been involved in and the videos from Black in Neuro. Although I'm not a neuroscientist, I have a social science background. I thought about becoming a neuroscientist after watching that video. It was really, really cool.
Thank you.
Okay, it's fine. Do you think that academic institutions support these very sort of niche networks? And if they don't, do you think they should support them?
Well, it's a no-brainer that they should. I will say that seeing the comparison as being a member of the committee, the support that we got from US institutions compared to UK institutions was quite stark. Again, I won't go into the specific details of who and what contributed, whether it was financial support, whether it was just support in general. But essentially in the UK, we only had support from two institutions, only one of which was a university and the other which was an association, which was quite sad for me. But that really has a lot to say about where the UK is in terms of having these talks about diversity and having these talks about inclusion, having these talks about anti-blackness. Because whatever you will say about the US's overt racism, and it's disgusting, they are having these conversations and some remedies are being put in place to deal with systemic racism. In the UK, I would say that's definitely not the case. We have, even in this country, we have something where we have inquiries that come out with recommendations with regards to various institutions on how they should change and their practices should be put in place. But very little is, or next to nothing is done. And I would like to see that change coming from institutions, because essentially if you do it from top down, you do a combined response, you can solve things quite easily. You can solve the diversity problem that exists. And I'm not just talking about my own institutions. I'm talking across the board, because as well as there being a lack of people actually getting into academia as Black people, there's also an awarding gap, which is called the attainment gap, but it's an awarding gap. And essentially, these problems exist everywhere. They exist in healthcare. They exist in education, from secondary school all the way up. They exist in the prison system and justice, or even with healthcare, as I mentioned before, with Black women being 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. So you see all these disparities. You've seen them again highlighted with COVID, with structural inequality and social inequalities there. So institutions really need to get to grips with the situation, actually talk to us and get past talking to us and look at the research that has been done. And it has been done for the past 50 years in this country. It definitely parallels with what is happening in the US, but we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on that. So yeah, on a whole, I think institutional support has been quite poor, and there definitely needs to be a hell of a lot more in that respect.
Yeah. And in the past few weeks, a lot of institutions, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, have put out statements saying they want to support sort of Black people to get into these institutions, but also feel comfortable. Has there been a shift in more institutions reaching out to you in light of those protests or not?
So it's been a bit of a mixed bag. And the reason I say that is because we've seen a lot of statements, and I feel that a lot of statements have only come about because other people are making statements, such that people or institutions don't want to feel left out or don't want to be seen as giving a bad press. Whereas a lot of these statements are not translating into direct action. They're not translating into changes. They're not translating into initiatives for Black students in order to deal with it. Because essentially, if we're saying that there is a systemic problem, then every part of society has a role to play in changing that problem. And across the board, I've seen a lot of statements, and some institutions have begun to reach out, but in terms of concrete actions, in terms of having things in place, there's very little of that. And essentially with the ongoing movements that we are seeing, these are nothing new. These sorts of deaths or killings with regards to police brutality, but in general, just wider systemic racism, we've seen things like these before. It's nothing new. Even during the lockdown period, there were 3 instances with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. But before that, there was Sandra Bland. Before that, there was Trayvon Martin. There are things that have been happening in the UK with regards to Stephen Lawrence, with Mark Dunn, with Sean King, if I remember. I've forgotten his name. But essentially, these are nothing new. There's how many people have been held under the Mental Health Act in the UK and turn up dead a few days later. And they are Black people, they are people of colour. So this is nothing new, is essentially what I'm trying to say. It's just the world happened to be watching because everyone was in lockdown and it could not be avoided. So essentially we're asking the time for talking, the time for statements, that's all done. Now we're looking for concrete actions because there's a problem here that has been ignored. It's been ignored in the US, it's been ignored in the UK, it's been ignored in Canada, it's been ignored in Australia. It exists with the indigenous population, Aboriginals. Been ignored in France, it's been ignored in Germany. It's been ignored across the board, essentially, what I'm trying to say. And anti-Blackness needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with top down, but it needs to be dealt with on a societal level, just in general. That's my few words on that.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I genuinely hope there's more action being taken. And hopefully with this podcast, if anyone's listening and they think they can support in any way, they reach out to the Afro-Caribbean Research Collective and the Black in Neuro Network. And you don't need to be Black, as De-Shaine said. Allies are just as important and have a lot to give to the cause as well. Is there anything you want to cover that we haven't spoken about?
I guess one thing I will say, as we are on an Imperial podcast, is we do have an Imperial Black Doctoral Network, and this name is subject to change, but it's coming, and we already had our first meeting, and I would like to put that out there in regards to that, after a suggestion that I did make about how the institution could help, and this was to my department, so Department of Bioengineering. This got escalated such that we have been able to set up a doctoral network. I would say, again, the onus is still on me, and it is often on a lot of underrepresented minorities to lead these things, but we do need the support. But essentially that network is coming, and I think that's very important, because especially at the postgraduate level and at PhD level, you can fall between the cracks, between being too old for certain societies, but being not recognized as a specific staff member such that you fall into a staff network. So essentially that's what the Imperial Black Doctoral Network is for. And I'd like to shout that out as an initiative that is developing currently, and to get at me for more details.
Awesome. Do you want to plug your socials so they know how to get at you or not?
Well, yeah, sure. That's fine. That's fine by me. So I'm Shane DM on Instagram, and that's ShainedDM. And on Twitter, I am Shane Neuro. So that's ShainenENEUR. Oh.
Awesome. Thank you, De-Shaine.
No problem.
We have come to the end of this episode. I have learned a lot about how you as a Black Caribbean student navigate academia, and I hope our listeners have taken a lot from this podcast as well. So please make sure you tune into our next podcast episode, where I'll be speaking to De-Shaine about the wider topic of improving access and outreach. And he's already touched on it, but the disproportionate burden that is on Black students and other minority groups to sort of lead a lot of access initiatives, and how we can start to rethink how academic institutions basically do access and outreach. So thank you.
Thank you, Fola.